Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. My name is Rhombus Tix. I'm going to be reading a story you heard a long time ago, if you're one of the 5 faithful listeners to the podcast, called Waiting for the Monsters to Die. However, since I'm reading this as part of a series called Swamp Castle, for consistency's sake in both the vocal tone, so I can make an audiobook of this and put it on YouTube, I'm going to be rereading it all in one piece. So here it is, Waiting for the Monsters to Die by Rhombus Tix. The explosion had the potential to make or break Madlan's career. All he had to do was balance the typhoon of political forces swirling around Fredson's death, and at the same time try to keep another crime from taking place. Oh, and of course he couldn't violate any of the stupid sacrosanct Xeno mandates. Piece of cake. Madlan walked across the holographic police tape and into the crime scene. The holograms didn't need to show the tape, of course, but people had expectations. Anything that helped them revive a sense of the past was in vogue, and would be for some time to come. The cage had long, high bars that stretched all the way around the complex, but it was completely empty now. The people with the Kane gene had nearly died off. A few of them still hoped to win an appeal to gain a longevity treatment, but with the rest of the planet praying for them to die, that wasn't likely to happen anytime soon. But now with Fredson dead, there were plenty of people would be more than happy to speed them along to the inevitable path to the grave. Talk about motive. Madx Torqueda Fredson, most revered man on the planet, most hated man on the planet, living saint, now he was a sadistic coat of paint on the inside of his quarters. Bits and pieces of him still slowly sliding down, clinging to the wall with only the original kinetic impact. Fredson was definitely dead, all right. The drones detected 747 pieces of his skull alone. There was deafening silence in the hall. No one wanted to be there. All of the other officers overseeing the work had decided to use proxy drones to investigate the site. Madlan was well within his rights to do the same, but he knew that there were some crimes that still were best solved with that human touch. The ability to see someone face to face and ask them questions. Crimes of emotion. Crimes like murder. Imbra, the spokeswoman for the Canes, or Rejected as they like to call themselves, looked up at Madlan from a large group of people gathered around the body. "We need to talk," Madlan nodded quietly. He tried to put his prejudices out of his mind. None of these people could fault what they were. He pointed to his hand, offering for her to lead the way, which she did. They walked away from the crater into a small adjoining office. Imbra looked at Madlan with haunted eyes, but she smiled thinly. "Thank you for coming. I believed in Fredson. He was a good man. He felt responsible for things he had no moral obligation to feel responsible for, and then spent the last half of his life being a focus for everyone that hated Canes. They started to transfer their hatred to him. Wasn't right." Madlan sat down on the opposite desk from her. Imbra didn't sit, really. She stood poised near the chair as if she wanted to sit, but not daring. "He's probably the only reason we're still alive," Madlan laughed callously. "You think? The Xenos don't much care what we do to each other. They care for what we'll do to them. So they're not going to descend from on high and save you. That's a fact, all right." Imbra's face paled and she sat in her chair at that. "Does the law even matter anymore?" Madlan sighed and raised his hands. "You want the truth?" Imbra shrugged. They both knew it. Madlan said it anyway. "There are some people that care, but the economic incentives are huge. We're talking about open trade with the entire galaxy. Earth was already a backwater, and we've had to wait an additional 45 years until the last people with the Kane gene pass away. I'm a cop, not some superhero. When 90% of the planet wants everyone here dead, you can bet that there isn't a damn thing I can do to stop it. Wish I could." Imbra looked surprised at that. "Do you mean that?" I do, actually." Now Madlan stood and paced back and forth uncomfortably. "Ever since we met the Xenos, they've twisted what it meant to be human. We've turned on each other. Someday we'll get back on track to better things, but not for a while. It's not right, but people just don't care." "Is that what we are? A sidetrack?" Do you know what I was before contact? Madlan shook his head. I was a ballet dancer. A dancer. How in the world could I be a threat to a bunch of powerful aliens? That sounds painful. Madlan leaned forward sympathetically. Painful? Painful is being told that no one will see a show because you're in it. Not because of what you've done, but because of what you are. One morning you think you're fine, and the next you're a freak just because some little blue dot on a map you've never seen before says that you could theoretically be a Kane. That's not right. Madlan shrugged. That battle had been fought and lost a long time ago. Well, the fact of the matter is that it is what it is. What I want to know is, which of the Kanes do you think most likely would want to harm Fredson? You're kidding, right? Edinburgh looked at him like he was an idiot. I mean, Fredson was the only man keeping us alive. Why in the world would someone want to kill him? You should look outside, not inside. Not my jurisdiction. There are the departments for that, Madlan shrugged. I just need to find out here who is responsible. You do see the hole in your logic right there. I mean, I could drive a truck through it. Madlan said, I just need... Ember held up her hand. I won't be part of a political whitewash. If you're not even looking outside the cage, then none of us here will help you justify blowing us up. She stood and left. Madlan sat there for a while thinking about what he'd said and how he had said it. Freudian slip? He had long thought himself emotionally detached from the situation, but maybe he really did think deep down that the monsters had done this. After all, the Xenos were right about so many other things, but they had been wrong at least some of the time. They weren't gods, after all. Madlan shook his head and stood, following her out of the room. They weren't gods, but they might as well be. Madlan looked up at the orange sky through the cage roof. No one got off Earth if they had even the slightest lingering hint of the Kane gene. The resulting pogrom had cleansed almost all trace of it from the human genome, one way or another, except those in the cage. On a hunch, he checked his phone and linked to the droids investigating the crime scene. Sure enough, it was military-grade explosive. No one inside the cage had the ability to manufacture it. So even if somehow, contrary to all logic, someone on the inside had helped, the source of that act had ultimately come from outside. He had a choice to make. He could try to solve the crime, or he could do his job. His job was to enforce the law inside the cage, but the person who'd done this almost assuredly came from outside it. Madlan walked into Fredson's quarters. They were immaculate, but no one could expect that from a living saint. There was a Persian rug in the north wall given to him out of gratitude for acting as an emissary between 5 nations that were all on the brink of war. He'd stopped that war from ever happening. On another wall lay a large mural from an artist that he suspected was worth millions. Bits of sculpture and other art and articles and photos were everywhere. It was a virtual parade of who's who of the most important, and they probably all hated him now. Not that they didn't have some reason to. Fredson was the man, the one man among billions that the aliens had chosen to warn humanity about the costs about going to the stars too early. All of the pain that it would cause, and he had worked hard at it. Fredson had tried dozens of stunts to get people to listen, even climbed the Empire State Building in a giant King Kong outfit. He'd written 3 books in just a year and a half and made a very compelling argument against the first trial of FTL, but it hadn't been enough. And thus, in humanity's moment of greatest triumph came its greatest defeat. In the initial days following the Stella's journey, people were jubilant. Not only had the act been successful, but they had made contact with aliens. Then people began to slowly realize that Fredson had been right all along about the aliens. His descriptions were too exact, and that description crushed the human spirit. Earth, the aliens had informed humanity, was a Class 12 world. That meant it contained a species that had killed another that was sentient and still retained the biological predisposition to do so. Earth's biologists stringently disagreed, showing all kinds of human proof about why they were wrong. The aliens didn't care. They showed proof of their own. The uncanny valley effect that creeped humans out about things that looked human but weren't were part of the Kane gene, an evolutionary mechanism to ensure the dominance of the species, which is why they had killed the Neanderthals, and the aliens were having none of it. Humanity was allowed access to all of the Sol system, but until they purged the Kane gene from themselves, they were restricted to that. The governments of Earth pursued this very seriously, but of course there were still people who built their own FTL ship and tried to get free, because that's the way humans are. And it was exactly as Fredson had predicted. The aliens caught them and then threw up the fishbowl. Only a human who had completely eradicated the Cain gene could get out, and only a few at a time. And as they did so, slowly the stories of the wonders of the galaxy began to return to Earth, and how much culture, wealth, and opportunities were there being missed because of the fishbowl. Efforts to eradicate the Cain gene increased. Some people supposedly, quote, removed themselves, end quote, for the good of society, in a lot of really suspicious ways. Others were just outright slaughtered by the mobs. People with the Cain gene began to retreat into gated communities or try and use radical technologies to mutate themselves to purge themselves of the gene. But until it was gone, the Xenos weren't lifting the fishbowl, and patience was running out. Eventually, there was only one community left where someone with the Cain gene could go, and people didn't give them long. Until Fredson went in to live with them, even though he didn't have the Cain gene. No one wanted to kill a living saint. Until now. Madlan looked carefully around the room for clues. It felt silly sometimes, but it worked. After a while in the job, you knew what to look for. Things that were out of the ordinary, patterns, and then he found the journal. Interesting. He turned it over and looked at the first visible entry. Things are looking bleak. I haven't received threats from my suppliers, and I have to be sure they don't threaten the people here. I admit, I might have made a mistake by protecting them, but it wasn't their fault. It was mine. Whoa, Fredson felt guilty for not stopping the Stella? How could he have hoped to? If I had used the device that the aliens had given me, then the Stella wouldn't have gone anywhere. It would have been another failed experiment among many, and humanity would have lingered around our own solar system for a while longer. We probably never would have been ready, but if it had lasted past my lifetime, at least I wouldn't have had to see it. Device? What device? Madlan had never heard anything about this. He flipped back through the first diary for clues, but it only went back to 2 years. At first, Madlan was about to give up, but then realized that there was the one diary, there might be others. He looked through the boxes in the closet and found what he was looking for. He flipped through the older diaries and found nothing especially useful. If I were an alien device, he thought, where would I put myself? He flipped randomly through the journal and didn't find any clues. It didn't matter. The truth was, if he was going to be effective at this, he was going to have to get them to come here. Madlan spent some time relaxing in a nearby bar, Gillico's, thinking of what he might be able to do to fix this situation. It was pretty much impossible. He sipped his drink, considering his options. He looked at some of the exotic dancers in their rich silver cages, half of them dressed like various human Xeno hybrids. Xenos were all humanity aspired to be these days. Madlan could hardly blame them. He looked at a large ball that dangled from the ceiling. It was silver and speckled, like a disco ball, but each fleck showed vistas of strange alien worlds, and when you looked at it, you were drawn in. It felt real, just like you were there. He could smell the marketplace on Jokotorath. He saw and felt thousands, no tens of thousands of alien species hustle and bustle around him. Some might say the aliens had sent the ball to taunt humanity. Madlan knew better. He knew that they really didn't think like that. It was a sympathetic gesture to give them the closest they could have to the real thing until they got their act together. There were hundreds of these all over Earth. No one knew how they worked, but since they were xenotech, most people didn't care. It might as well have been magic. And then it hit him. Magic. Of course. Why hadn't he thought of it before? He called HQ. Ed. Command HQ, how can I help you, Officer Madlan? The tone on the other end was crisp, clear, and professional. Ed. Why so formal? The professionalism went away, and followed by an audible groan. Oh, good Lord. What do you want, Madlan? Law enforcement and certain other government functions had a lot of access to the toys the Xenos had owned that others didn't. They might live inside the fishbowl, but that didn't mean there weren't all kinds of grants that the more benevolent aliens used among themselves to assuage their guilt at depriving the poor humans so much. Nothing you won't miss much. Speak. It's just I need something for the Fredson investigation. There was a pause. They both knew how politically sensitive this one was. What is it? I remember reading through the department inventory list the other day, and if I remember right, one of the things the Xenos loaned us was a QLED. I don't remember what the science boys call this, but it could make a replication of someone using a small amount of DNA and A basic avatar software program. It wasn't perfect, but yeah, a quick clone. Yeah, sure, what about it? Prep it for me, I got an idea. On it. Madlan liked Ed. He was a consummate professional in just about everything. Of course, being an honest cop in a dishonest world meant you were stuck sometimes doing desk duty in an armpit inventory room, but at least he didn't have to clean exploded Saint off the wall. Madlan left the bar and flew over to the station 4 miles away. The local LE, law enforcement complex, was over 40 stories tall and was designed to serve the specialized needs of any cops for a 25-mile radius. Its practical range was more like 5, since most cops weren't willing to take the time dealing with bureaucracy necessary to use the full force of it beyond that. He walked through the large glass doors that said to protect and serve, with the E missing, faded off the end so that it always looked to Madlan like sever instead of serve. Then again, he'd always frightened his teachers when he administered the practical intelligence test. He could think of more things to do with a hammer than most people wanted to know. Madlan walked to the elevator, down the basement stairs, and into the locker room that belonged to the 21st century. Ed was short and a little fat, but muscled nevertheless. Rumor had it he worked out a lot with nothing else to do down there. He had the crick chrome plept? Ed nodded and reached down, pulled out an innocent-looking blob of pottery with a small slot in one end. Xenos were often not known for their sense of aesthetic. Rather, their aesthetic did not resemble that of humans. How does it work? Madlan did not want to mess around with something like this without reading the manual. It's an alien language, he pointed to the pad, and the translator software we have only gives a 45% accuracy in the translation, or chance of accuracy in the translation. Why would the Xenos give us this equipment without a manual showing us how to use it? Madlan sighed. Typical Xeno behavior. They helped, but it was your problem if you couldn't do anything about it. At least that proved that they weren't infallible, in theory at least. Ed looked at him. How sure are you want to do this? Ed leaned against the counter and struck his fingers through his long dreadlocks. They reminded people of Barbarians, one of the 10 most populous species in the galaxy. Madlan had thought about getting some himself sometimes. Madlan sighed and held out his hand. Very. Ed handed him the pad. Madlan hit the translate button and proceeded to read. Slot. Stick slot. Piece by piece. Do not use cats or various other small burrowing animals nearby the device. Maxima Cartel not responsible for small cat-like human clone hybrids. Maxima Cartel dance on farts. No cats in hole. Verbally address whole upon kiss from part. Parts not other parts. No cats. Identify ID number with firm, strong bellow, and clear area. Add water. No cats. What the hell? So there was obviously a slot, and he was supposed to put Fredson's DNA in it. That much made sense. He obviously wanted to make sure there was no cat DNA in the facility. Maybe. ID number. Since it was supposed to build an AI based on the residual net activity, well, it made about as much sense as anything else, really. Madlan put the chunk of Fredson's DNA in the slot and entered Fredson's government-issued ID into its interface. Nothing happened. They poured a small amount of water into the slot as well. Maybe the Xenos idiot-proofed it or something. There was a loud whooshing sound as it grew out and inflated into the spitting image of Fredson. Fredson? That would I be. That would be I. The voice was perfect. Madlan couldn't tell the difference. Do you know who and what you are? I am a replica of Fredson, consisting of his basic thoughts and memories. I am still compiling data. Good. I have something I want you to read. Can you read? Fredson, too, looked insulted. Madlan shrugged and gave him Fredson's diary. It probably wasn't duplicated in the ether. The doppelganger took about 4 minutes, flipping methodically through the pages, and nodded. I have assimilated the information. Matson nodded. Do you think it helps you become more like Fredson? It does. Any thoughts on who you killed him? Or any thoughts on who killed you? The doppelganger shook its head. I have no idea. I have no one who hates me. Not really. I get some angry emails sometimes, but they want me to leave. Nothing that has threatened violence. Madlan sighed. Yeah, I thought that might be enough. Come this way. Or I thought that might not be enough. Come this way. The two of them left. Edson waved to Ed as they left. Matson kept a very low profile, keeping the ether signal to a minimum, and as all the windows tinted. Several of the techniques he used were almost illegal, but he wasn't taking any chances. Once he pulled the car into the private garage, he carefully checked to make sure no one could see him. He pulled out a bag and put it over Fredson 2's head. Wear this. Why? Because I don't want anyone to see you. Fredson grunted in annoyance, but didn't say anything. The Quicks clone was a better copy than Madlan was expecting. Once they got inside, it was a little bit harder. Several of the caged were looking at him rather oddly, and the blanket that he put over Fredson too didn't help. They were polite at first, but as time went on, more and more began to pop their heads out of their doors and look. Finally, by the time he got to Fredson 2 doors, Ember was standing in front of him, waiting for him with her arms clasped. Ember said, "Who do you have under that blanket, Mr. Madlan? You know that we don't like strangers here, and especially strangers we can't see. I'll explain in private." "Please do." She folded her arms in front of her chest. There was an awkward pause. She didn't move. Madlan sighed. "Would you please step aside?" "You want to speak in private? In Fredson's house?" She cocked her head to the side, unfolding her arms and strained her dress. "Yes." She sighed and opened the panel. The three of them went inside, but the small crowd had gathered outside the door and began to speak in hushed whispers. When the door shut behind them, Madlan took off the blanket, and Ember gasped, "What? How?" "He's a quick clone." Fredson, too, looked at Madlan. "You know I'm right here." "What are you? Who are you?" Ember looked back and forth between Fredson 2 and Madlan. Madlan explained, "It's a bit of Xenotech." Ember immediately calmed down. Madlan might as well have said, "It's magic," but in this case, it was a magic that everyone had run into at one point or another. "Why?" "Because I actually want to catch Fredson's killer, that's why." Ember uncrossed her arms and then recrossed them, her clenched fists making her knuckles turn white despite the calm look on her face. "I'm glad. Truly I am, but I don't see how it buys you time. But more importantly, it makes the killer come to me." Madlan sat down on one side of Fredson's chairs. "It's a matter of jurisdiction. I can't exercise law enforcement power outside of the cage." Ember's face lit up with comprehension. "So you're making the killer think he's alive and come here. That's brilliant, Madlan." Fredson, too, looked at the nearby dresser and walked towards it. He studied a moment, then pulled out a hidden drawer. He took out a small note and unfolded it. Madlan was shocked. "How did you know that was there?" Fredson, too, smiled. "Well, I put it there." "But how did you know it?" Fredson, too, thought a moment and then stared off into space. "I had sent that drawer to a carpenter a few years ago. I didn't have any reason to do that, so I assumed it was because I wanted some place to hide things. A weapon, perhaps." He began to read the note. "Oh, dear." "What is it?" Madlan, too, stepped closer and read the note. Fredson handed it to him. Fredson, too, sighed. "I don't think your killer is going to come." "Why not?" "Because he's already here. I killed myself." "That doesn't make any sense." Ember was indignant. "That note could be a fake." Fredson, too, looked it over. "It could be, but it matches my writing very well. According to the note, I was tired of being alone." Ember's eyes began to well up. "You weren't alone. Everyone here loved you." Fredson, too, didn't say anything. Madlan didn't need him to. He'd read enough of Fredson's diary to know what his sentiment towards the cage had become less sympathetic over time. He disliked their hostility towards everyone else in the Xenos. They had just assumed he was one of them and talked freely about what they really thought. He wasn't one of them, and he never would be. Madlan finally sighed. "So how do you feel about that, Fredson? Do you think it was selfish?" "Yes." "So what do you think we should do about it?" Fredson, too, didn't say anything. "I think that you should keep yourself alive and stay here." Madlan couldn't believe he was saying this, but there it was. Fredson, too, nodded. Ember looked at Madlan. "What? Can that work?" Madlan shrugged. "I have no idea, but it's worth a try." Fredson, too, nodded, unhappy but obedient. Madlan looked at Ember. "Can you keep it secret?" Ember flushed. "I suppose I could, but if you don't, you're probably all going to be killed. You realize that?" Ember nodded. "So do you think you can keep it quiet?" Ember nodded again. Madlan finished writing his most recent report on his wristpad. "Source of false bomb unknown. Fredson was discovered hidden, a hostage within the cage itself. I plan to continue the investigation of the situation and hope to bring the subject to justice within a few weeks. I have a few leads, but nothing specific. We'll keep you informed." He signed and leaned back into his desk. The locals had accepted the doppelganger. Law enforcement had accepted the doppelganger. How could they not? Fredson, too, was as good as the original. In fact, in some ways, he was better. He didn't have a lot of the crap that humans had with them, like emotional baggage that caused them to behave like jerks or kill themselves, and thus causing the indirect deaths of hundreds of people. No wonder the Xenos had put humanity in lockup. There was just one more loose end that had to be taken care of. Madlan looked at the manifest inside the Xeno inventory department. Hey, Ed, do we have any kind of a memory wiping device in stock? Edlin thought a moment and looked into the computer. He found a small flashlight-looking device and handed it to Madlan. I think that's what you need right there. What do you need it for? To protect the Quick Clone. From who? Madlan looked at Ed sadly. From you. He shined the light in his eyes. Sorry, buddy. Now that Fredson had been healed by Xenotech, he was going to be around to protect the cage for a very long time. Fuck the rest of the Earth. He wasn't going to have the cage just die for people shopping privileges on his watch. So, flat out going to say it. Of all the stories in this series, I think this is my best. Could I have written it better now? Probably. It is by far the best idea I've had so far. It's a confluence of a lot of themes that I write on, including post-humanity, the problems of humanity, eugenics, transgenics, and, how alien aliens can be, and how nasty humans can be. I think aliens are going to have, there's a reason the aliens haven't contacted us yet, and I don't think it's the prime directive. I think it's the fact that we're very murderous, thuggish, petty people when it comes down to it. A third of us still think that electing Trump is a great idea. Politics aside, there's a lot of things that really work very well in this story. Madlan has a character. Fredson has a dynamic. I keep the number of characters light. The description is high. Frankly, of any story I ever submitted for publication, this one is probably the closest, I think, to getting published. And the fact that it didn't, in hindsight, tells me that I really just never should have tried in the first place. I'm going to write, and I'm going to write for me. And I'm going to be a self-published author. Even if a publisher comes to me, I'm going to be skeptical. That's not to say that I will never accept a publishing deal, but it does mean that there's a certain freedom at this point of being able to write whatever I want and publish whatever I want in any format I want. This story, in my opinion, I've worked in, I don't know if I've mentioned this in this series or even in the podcast before, but at one point I worked for a short fiction magazine, semi-professional, at Brigham Young University called The Leading Edge. And I worked in their slush pile, and it definitely helped me a lot as a writer. In fact, if you get a chance to work as a volunteer in a slush pile as a writer, I highly recommend it, because seeing what other people write and the common mistakes they make will give you a practical experience at self-editing and writing that editing your own material will never give you. As a writer, you should be a reader, for sure. And you should read and read and read and read. Stephen King is right. But the experience that I gained as a slush pile volunteer is not something to be discounted either. But, having worked as a slush pile volunteer, I'll tell you, this story should have gotten through a couple of slush piles. This story is the best I've ever written. And while it's not perfect, I mean, it's definitely not Hugo or Nebula material. It should have been published somewhere, and I'm ad hoc guessing I submitted this to probably 10 to 20 different magazines, and I never heard anything. I never even got some of the encouraging comments that you sometimes get from editors. I've gotten a few, but not on this story. And at the end of the day, I'll be honest, folks, being published is a combination of luck and grit and determination and skill. But you should not take it personally if you're not published. You should just stop messing around with gatekeepers. Either way, I'm going to rate this an A+. It's definitely the best I've written. It's not the best of all time, but it's definitely the most publishable thing I've ever done. So if you're listening to the entirety of the series and taking notes on what you should or shouldn't do, this is a do. This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright 2022.
To fight the forces of evil!